The project that I'm working on now is looking at organizations that are putting these insights into practice. And in particular, looking at companies, startups in software, advertising, or other fields that are moving to 4-day weeks or to other kinds of shorter working periods without cutting salaries or profitability, and are finding that that all kinds of benefits come from moving to shorter hours rather than traditional 40-hour weeks or conventional startup hours of 168 if possible. And so what I want to do today is to talk about these couple projects, and particularly the benefits of sort of thinking about work and rest together, and thinking a little bit about also what this implies for the future of work. So one of the things that we talk about a lot talk about innovation or promotion of innovation. So talk about innovation ecosystems, right? This is a very familiar concept. It's one that people started using in Silicon Valley in the 1970s or 1980s, and it has become quite popular. Now, one of the things about ecosystems, of course, is that they tend to be focused on space. Most people who think about innovation ecosystems are concerned with issues of kind of innovation geography. If you're someone like Richard Florida, they're interested in questions about how you design spaces, whether they are technology parks, whether they are offices, whether they are individual desks, around how it is you design spaces or resources or connections between people to encourage or maximize innovation and creativity. But natural ecosystems have another property, which is they have a temporal dimension, right? There are creatures that are busy during the day, there are creatures that are nocturnal, there are ebbs and flow in temperature, in energy, sunlight, rain, etc., over the course of 24 hours, over the course of seasons, over the course of decades. And so far, most of us who think about innovation ecosystems or think about creativity or work have not paid a lot of attention to those kinds of rhythms, and have not thought very much about how we can take advantage of those to help people work better, to help ourselves be more creative, or to have more sustainable and longer lives and careers or companies. And this is really what I want to talk about today, is how we can think about time in new ways to help redesign the workday, to help us be more focused, more creative, to help to apply this both to individuals and to companies, and to think a little bit about what this might mean for the future of work. Now, we have, I think, since at least the Industrial Revolution, thought about work time in very kind of mechanical and in some ways simple sorts of ways. The factory was, among other things, a place that turned time from something that followed, the rhythms of nature to a space whose time followed the rhythms of machines and economies. So one of the features of factory time was that time inside the factory ignored the rules that existed outside the factory. An enclosed, controlled space in which you worked to the pace of the machine. You tended to work for certain periods of time as opposed to working in order to complete projects. And you did this day in, day out, originally for 7 days, and then with the rise of union movements, 6 days, and eventually 5. But this idea of time within the workspace, time within the factory being undifferentiated, being set by clocks rather than projects, followed us into office work and often service work. So that what we ended up with was a kind of vision of the workday as an undifferentiated whole. So the idea with most kinds of work today is that, it happens from 9 to 5, let's say. Every moment of the day, every hour is more or less equal to every other hour. So it doesn't matter if you have a meeting here, or if you're doing other kinds of work at one time versus another. All of this time is treated as essentially equivalent. And then, if you want to do more work, you stretch these out. Come in earlier, work later, what have you. This has also been extended by, of course, the rise of smartphones, of other portable devices, which allow us to carry our offices around with us everywhere now, and which make it possible to extend this essentially infinitely. It's also become more extendable by the fact that it's become more extendable in industries where there are not often obvious stopping points, right? When you worked in a factory, the factory whistle blew. When you were a farmer, the sun went down and you came in from the fields, and there were clear measures of your productivity for that day. Now, how many widgets you made, how many acres you were able to plow. But in creative work, it's often the case that these kinds of standards these kinds of measures are very difficult to come up with. And so time tends to become a substitute for other measures of productivity. So for all of these reasons, we live in a world in which work time is treated as essentially the same, no matter, or throughout the day. It's treated as extendable, and it's very difficult to construct boundaries that were around that work. Now, in my last book about rest, I talked about the role that rest plays in the lives of Nobel Prize winners, famous writers, artists, painters, even politicians and generals. And one of the things that I found was that, these are incredibly dedicated, ambitious people, right? People who often are working in very competitive fields, scientists who are racing to make discoveries before their colleagues do, generals who are trying to win wars. And these are people who are very devoted to their work, who are very ambitious. They're people who often will sort of organize their entire lives around their work. But when you dive into their daily schedules, you see something very interesting, which is that they don't organize their entire day around working. Rather, people like Albert Einstein or Charles Darwin or Stephen King or Toni Morrison, these are people who often would arrange their daily schedules so that they worked not for very long hours, but for brief, intensive periods. So their daily schedule tended to look like this. So rather than having long periods where they would be working, their work would be concentrated into periods of about 4 hours, where they would work often starting fairly early in the morning, work very intensively, and then have an equally long period of deliberate rest. So they would do things like go on long walks, exercise, do other kinds of things that are apparently not productive, but actually turn out to be really valuable for their creative lives. Because it turns out that we have a great capacity to sort of solve problems unconsciously, or when we allow our creative subconscious time to work on problems that have occupied our effort, they're often able to make progress on them, sometimes on problems that have eluded our conscious solution. So John Cleese talked about that. John Cleese, who was one of the founders of Monty Python, talked about discovering this when he was first writing comedy, when he was a student at Cambridge. And he said that he would work on a sketch and not be able to finish it. And he'd get stuck, and he would stop for the night, he'd go to bed, and then come back to it the next morning. And he said that he often would find that not only could he finish the joke, but he couldn't even remember what the problem had been the night before. And he also had another experience where he wrote a sketch and then lost it. And this was put it somewhere and then had to rewrite it. So he rewrites it and then finds the original. And when he compares them, he realizes that over the couple days between finishing the first draft and thinking he'd lost it, the second version was sharper, the jokes were better, it had a better ending. And what he took from these experiences was a kind of respect for his subconscious, right? In the first case, it was able to work on problems overnight. In the second case, clearly part of his mind had continued working on that sketch even after he thought he had finished it, and produced a better version the second time around. And a version of this, now this often sounds like something that's kind of mysterious and difficult to control. But in fact, first of all, it's something that neuroscientists have come to understand much more clearly in the last 20 or so years. But it's also the case that this is something that we can learn to do, and we can learn to do better, and that we can harness using schedules like these. So what these people are doing is two things. I mean, first of all, obviously in these highly focused periods, part of what you're able to do is get a whole bunch of obvious work done, right? The 1,000 words a day that you're trying to write as a writer, the lines of code, sort of filling in a scene in a painting. And then, having worked really intensively on this and stopping, this period of time gives your subconscious time to work on problems that you haven't finished here. And what happens, as often as not, is that some of the answers get solved by this other creative, unconscious part of your mind while you're focused on something else. And this is a kind of pattern that I've seen in probably hundreds of creatives. And it concludes at the end with often in the later afternoon with another hour or so, taking the ideas that have bubbled up here and making use of them and setting up for the next day, so that when you start again early in the morning, you know exactly what you're going to be working on, and you can begin immediately. That setup is also important because over the course of these hours, that turns out to encourage your subconscious mind to begin working on tomorrow's problems and of tonight. So it turns out that rest really is essential in the lives of really creative people, because not only does it give them time to recover the physical and the mental energy that you spend doing really intensive work, and I think we tend to underestimate just how physically taxing serious cognitive work is, but it also provides additional time for solving problems without conscious work. Now, part of the reason that they tend to work in the do their most focused work in the early morning is, number one, it's easier to stay focused before too much of the day has passed because it's easier to maintain self-control. You have fewer decisions to make about what to do that day. But also, for many of us, we tend to be more creative earlier in the day rather than later. So psychologists have been looking at how people perform on creativity tests administered at different times of day. And it turns out that many of us perform better on these tests early in the morning rather than in the afternoon or late at night. There are a few people who genuinely who are better on these tests or late in the evening, but they're far smaller than the number of us who actually think that we're night owls and will, will have ideas flowing, after the evening news or after midnight. So now this respect for the kind of daily rhythm of our creative capacity, respect for the fact that we have more energy at certain times of day than others and are capable of doing doing difficult work that demands high performance is something that we're starting to see applied in other fields in very different kinds of ways. So, for example, in sports, in the last 20 or so years, there have been, we've seen among elite athletes, the use of sleep coaches and managers who pay a lot of attention to how much rest athletes are getting, to designing regimens on road trips so that people get plenty of rest. Elite athletes like LeBron James, who's one of the greatest basketball players of all time, will now talk about how they get generally about 12 hours of sleep a day because what LeBron is doing is so physically demanding that in order to recover from a really hard game, you simply need that much sleep. Roger Federer, the tennis player, when he's on tour, he travels with coach and entourage and so forth. He actually rents 2 houses, and one is just for him to sleep in, and another one is for everybody else, because it's that important for him to get to be able to control the environment where he sleeps, to get enough rest. You also see a somewhat different. So for these guys, what's essential is being able to maintain peak energy, peak focus, peak intensity at various times when they're at home or when they're on the road. And when they're traveling, they give a lot of attention to figuring out when they should do things like rest, when they should take naps, to recover quickly from jet lag so that they can be at their best when game time starts. There's another community of elite performers who've been scaling back work times in an effort to make work more sustainable and also to make themselves more creative, and that is elite restaurants. This is Noma in Copenhagen, and this is the new version of Noma that just opened last year. They moved about a mile or so, rebuilt the kitchen, and just relaunched last year. One of the things that they did after being listed as the world's best restaurant in surveys 4 years in a row was to go from a 6-week-a-night schedule, I believe, down to 4 nights a week. And Rene Redzepi, the founder of Noma, decided to go to 4 nights a week because, number one, 6 nights a week is really, really intense, right? You've got a staff who are working often 10 or 12 or 14 hours a day, and going down to 4 nights meant that he would lose fewer people. The people who were working for him would be able to have better service. You have more, essentially, emotional energy. So you're nicer to patrons. You're nicer to each other. But it also meant having more time to do things like experiment with new dishes. to try out new cooking techniques, to do the kinds of work that Noma really has to do in order to stay the world's best restaurant. And it's only one of a number of restaurants that have made this move. There's one, probably Noma's biggest competitor, is a restaurant called Maimo, which is located in Oslo, Norway, which has moved now to a 3-day week. Lots of others have gone down to 4 nights, and they've all done so in an effort to make the work more sustainable, but also to deliver better work and to give themselves more time both to recover from the intensity of restaurant work and to give themselves more time to develop more interesting dishes, to explore other kinds of cuisines, or to do other things that stimulate their imagination, stimulate their creative thinking, and help them design new kinds of food. And finally, I'll talk about startups. So what I've been looking at have been companies mainly working in software, in financial services, and advertising. And these are companies that have gone down to 4-day weeks, so 32 hours a week, or have moved to 6-hour or sometimes even 5-hour days, so 30 hours or 25. So here's just a list of them. And they go from, you can say on one end, companies that have decided, okay, we're going to have 40-hour weeks, and after that we're going to kick everybody out. And then companies that have created hybrid schedules where you have 4 work days and then 1 day that is free, that in which you can come in and you can work on your own stuff, you can pursue your own side projects, or you can be at home and you can do whatever, or spend your time however you like. 4-day companies, so these generally are working Monday through Thursday. Some of them will have staggered schedules, so some people are working Monday through Thursday, others are Tuesday through Friday, depending upon how much time, how accessible you need to be to clients or to customers. Some doing 6-hour days, so 30 hours, and then 5-hour days. Now, what all these companies are started by people who are serial entrepreneurs. They're people who have experience working in Google or McKinsey or big accounting firms. They're people who have run their own companies before, and so they tend to be more experienced, and they all decide, with this company, I don't want to do the 70 hours any longer. They reach the conclusion that those long hours are either counterproductive, they are unnecessary, and that they think now they can construct work days that will allow them to do everything that they need to do, but also still have more of a life. So how do they do this? It turns out that moving from, let's say, a 50 or 60-hour work week down to 32 requires less magic than you would expect. Mainly, it's a matter of good management and good process. So there are, across all of these different industries and different companies, a couple things that every single one of them does. First off, they are a lot more conscious about how they use their technologies. So even though these are IT companies, have people who have been accustomed to living with the window with code open and also the Slack channel and 5 other windows or programs open, they're a lot more thoughtful about how they use technologies and how they manage interruptions and distractions. Now, it turns out there's a really interesting study by a professor named Gloria Mark, who was looking at multitasking and distraction in offices, and found that on average, people will work for about 40 seconds or so on a task before switching over to do something else. Even if it's, even if you're not responding to an external stimulus, people today tend to kind of self-distract about every 40 seconds. The other thing is that psychologists have found that it takes about 10 or 15 minutes or so to really sink into a problem, to really get focused. And so what this means is that if you are interrupted every few minutes, or if you self-interrupt every 40 seconds or so, it becomes virtually impossible during the course of the day to get into that state where you are really thinking deeply about a problem in that way that I think we've all experienced, can often be essential for solving it. So using technologies more thoughtfully in a way that allows them to get into and stay in those states is the first essential thing. The other thing that Mark found was that on average, with distractions, technology-driven distractions, meetings, people just dropping in and with one quick question that turns into 15 minutes, between all of those things, we lose maybe 2 to 4 hours of productive time every day. So if you can eliminate that, then you're saving a couple hours right there. Another thing that they do is they are, like the people I talk about in REST, a lot more conscious about constructing time during the day for focused, dedicated work. Now what this means usually is 2 things. And number one, having a period in the day when everybody has the freedom to ignore email, Slack, whatever. You don't have to answer the phone. You are discouraged from interrupting other people unless it's a real emergency. And it's a time that's set aside for everybody at the same time every day. For reasons I don't need to get into, that sort of routine is a valuable thing. The second thing that you do is cut meetings down to an absolute minimum. So the weekly team meeting that goes for an hour every Monday morning is, if it exists, it's 5 minutes. You stand up and then you go off and do other things. Any other kind of meeting tends to be very short. You set an agenda beforehand, you have very clear things that you need to do, and then as soon as they're done, the meeting, you are free to leave. You don't have to stay for the entire hour that the meeting is scheduled. And indeed, many of them will go in and reset the defaults on calendar programs to, let's say, 15 or 20 minutes. Because one of the odd things about calendar programs is that they tend to set 1 hour as the default time for meeting. We generally don't really think about that fact. And so 1 hour becomes kind of the natural time that a meeting lasts. Well, you do a couple of these a day, then other people start scheduling meetings that are by default an hour long. That adds up to some pretty serious time before too long. The other thing that thinking about shorter work days or implementing shorter work days forces companies to think about is what your really critical tasks are and what the less important ones are. There is when you go down to 32 or 30 hours, you end up having to think really hard about what things the company does or what things you do individually that actually really matter, that create value, that help you focus, that help you get work done, and which things really you can just get rid of. So, all of these things, designing time during the day for focused work, limiting meetings, controlling technology, thinking about what your most important tasks are. None of this is incredibly difficult. None of it also is necessarily very high tech. There are some companies that do use a lot of tech in order to support this. They tend, of course, to be tech companies. So, experimenting with, let's say, smart light bulbs that start to change colors 23 minutes into a meeting, or using various internet blocking programs, or building little tools that will, sort of buzz if ambient noise goes above a certain level. There are some companies that are into this kind of thing, and sort of it is sometimes a fun way to think about and to engage these questions. A couple of them have turned into products, but for plenty of other companies, simply better leadership, better management, and a clearer understanding among everybody of what the rules of the office are and how the day ought to unfold. Just that can be enough to allow a company to do the same amount of work in shorter periods and while keeping clients and customers happy. Now, on that note, all of the companies that that I've been looking at have reported that not only does it turn out that they're able to do the same work in shorter periods of time, but many of them also claim that they can do better work. Partly this is a function of the fact that for an advertising agency, for example, intensivity of work often beats long work. So, when you're thinking about how to frame a product or the graphic design for an advertisement, being able to really focus on that for several hours gets you a lot farther than working on it in a semi-distracted way over the course of a 12-hour day. It's also the case that this is useful for companies that are working in areas that are outside Silicon Valley or London or other big tech hubs or financial hubs, but want to attract people who otherwise would be going to Facebook or Bain or YPP. So these are companies. So if you're located in a place like Glasgow, Scotland, or where several of these companies are, or Hobart, Tasmania, you're competing with people who otherwise would be going to work in London or going to work in Sydney, but for whom, who wouldn't necessarily think about moving to Scotland or to, the island off the coast of the island of Australia. But being able to work a 4-day week or a 6-hour workday is a powerful enough incentive, especially for older, more experienced workers. People who themselves have been around, have worked in places where they had to do 50 or 60-hour weeks, and like these founders, recognize that yes, there are times when that's necessary, but there's an awful lot of time where that's just about kind of demonstrating how committed and how busy you are to your supervisors, rather than actually about getting serious work done. It's also the case that not only is recruitment easier, but retention rates also go up. As some of you probably know, if you're a relatively small company, having to hire one more person is actually, that's a really significant thing for a CEO, and having to replace people is a big thing as well. And so one of the real benefits of shorter hours is you end up spending a lot less time on retention. So for all of these reasons, it turns out shorter hours turn out to be not only a stimulus for creativity, a way to improve practices, but they're also themselves highly practical. And they are things that dozens of companies are already doing right now, and which can be implemented without a lot of investment, a lot of money spent. It's really mainly about good leadership and being thoughtful about how you use your technology about how you spend your time during the day and about what things you ought to be spending your time on. The last thing that it reveals is the degree to which the kinds of problems of focus and distraction that we all struggle with actually are social problems rather than individual ones that demand social solutions rather than personal. Now, as someone who's written 2 books that are kind of in the self-help realm, I am a little guilty of promoting this idea that, if you are distracted at work, if you have trouble, sort of being as productive or as creative as you would like to be, that the solution is to reorganize your workday or to do things, on your phone at your desk with your time. But there are limits to how effective those things are, because there are very powerful economic and social and organizational incentives that are pushing back against all of those individual efforts. And one of the things that the people who work at these companies report is just how powerful it is, how much they recognize, and how surprising it is to discover that essentially other people determine their level of attention. We think of attention as this, individual personal thing, but it's really something that is easily captured and interrupted by others. And so working in places where there are clear understandings about the importance of focus, the importance of attention, and that recognize that my capacity to concentrate and your capacity to get your work done depends upon all of us having shared rules that recognize the value of focus and act accordingly is an amazingly powerful thing. I think this is also important, and I'll close with this, because what they suggest is a way of thinking about work and technology and time that both pushes back against a lot of assumptions that we have about the kind of moral value or absolute necessity of overwork, but which also is, and which are important as well for thinking about how we can use or how we can design new technologies to help us make better choices and to better shape the future of work. We are just at the beginning of a period where, thanks to artificial intelligence, thanks to automation and robotics, this is my son about 10 years ago. We're at a point where just over the horizon are a set of technologies that could transform the way that we work. There are all kinds of forecasts about what impacts these are going to have, right? There are consulting companies that suggest that hundreds of millions of jobs in the service sector and the professions could be lost to automation, could be lost to robotics. There are likewise claims that, thanks to that, essentially that while these will destroy jobs, they also will ultimately create others, and so we shouldn't worry too much about this. But I think what the example of the companies that I've been looking at tell us is that it's possible, that the assumption that these technologies are simply going to come into the workplace and have some kind of effect that we can neither fully predict nor control is incorrect. That, just as they have pushed back against the assumptions that mobile technologies and sort of other technologies have to keep us perpetually connected to the office, that they can only be used to support longer hours rather than shorter. they've shown that you can use these same technologies in very, very different kinds of ways for very different kinds of outcomes, so long as you're thoughtful about it, right? If you set out the intent of moving to a 4-day week or to a 5-hour workday, you can take these same technologies and often just redesigning them a little bit or rethinking how you use them, make them into tools that help you save time rather than spend time. And I think that's important because, we have great opportunities to design robotics, to design artificial intelligence systems, to augment our abilities, right? To extend, in some cases, our physical capacity, in other cases, our memory, in other cases, sort of our ability to manage complex tasks. And it's possible to design them to do that or to simply replace all of us. And all too often, I think, our assumption is that the replacement scenario is inevitable. In fact, I think it's not. That we can use these technologies and we can use the example of these companies to think about how to create a future of work that not only includes people, but also sets as one of its central aims the creation of workplaces that are more creative, that are better places to work, that allow us to actually get work done rather than endlessly consuming our times, and that consequently help us be better workers, to be more satisfied, and I think as a result to be happier people as well. So, thank you all for coming.